Hello, everyone. I'm Hans Engel from the Directors Guild of Canada. Thank you for joining us for this year's online version of DGC Visionaries. Over the last few years, DGC Visionaries has become a must-attend event at many of our top film festivals, bringing together some of the most interesting filmmakers with films at the fests. This year, we're taking Visionaries online and sharing it clear across the country, highlighting as many brilliant filmmakers coast to coast as we can. All DGC Visionaries sessions are being recorded and will be posted on the DGC National YouTube channel. I'm thrilled and honored to be here with these guests. This is an amazing rematch from 2003, when the original The Corporation was released. We're speaking with award-winning director Jennifer Abbott about her two new incredible documentaries, The New Corporation, the unfortunately necessary sequel, the sequel to the giant doc, The Corporation, and the film, The Magnitude of All Things. The New Corporation is at TIFF, Finn Atlantic Film Festival, Calgary International Film Festival, and the Vancouver Film Festival, among others. The Magnitude of All Things is premiering at the Vancouver International Film Festival and is also playing Planet in Focus and Rhythm in Montreal, with many more to come. I cannot think of anyone better to lead this conversation than Avi Lewis. Avi Lewis is an award-winning documentary filmmaker, journalist, and lecturer in journalism and media studies at Rutgers University. His 25-year journalism career has spanned theatrically released feature documentaries, This Changes Everything in 2015, and The Take in 2004, both amazing films, as well as local news reporting, appearing on television networks worldwide. And in 2017, he co-founded and is now strategic director of The Leap, an organization launched to upend our collective response to the crises of climate, inequality, and racism. I'm thrilled to introduce our featured director. Jennifer Abbott is a Sundance and Genie Award-winning filmmaker who's been making films about urgent social, political, and environmental issues for 25 years. She's best known as one of the directors and editor of The Corporation, frequently described as the most successful documentary in Canadian history. Among other films, she also co-directed, co-wrote, and edited Us and Them, co-wrote and edited Sea Blind, EP'd and edited I Am, and made the short film Brave New Minds. Before we bring them in, let's roll the trailers for both of these incredible films. Note, Zoom isn't the best platform for video sharing, but it will give you a taste of what's to come. Ryan, please roll those trailers.
Everyone can relate to grief of losing a loved one. But grief of losing your homeland, you don't realize how much you've lost until you stop and think about it.
Es como destruir nuestro corazón.
It's like we're all implicated by admitting that the way we live is causing a catastrophe.
If this land hurts, we hurt.
La destrucción de la madre tierra es nuestra destrucción.
This culture is so unbelievably fucked.
It's time for revolution.
The thing with climate change, it's not like there's been one death and then we grieve it. This is continuous.
We need to tell the truth. We can't hide things just because it's not hopeful.
Out of the way! Will my grandchildren's eyes still be able to see what I see?
Estamos en un punto muy crítico.
The greed economy is killing us. We are so steeped in this commodification that it's hard to distinguish between being a consumer and being a citizen.
Seeing the documentary The Corporation, it opened my eyes.
Calling corporations psychopaths absolutely had an impact.
Can we take the resources of corporations and get them to focus on the needs of the poorest?
There is no such thing as corporate social responsibility.
They're literally playing casino with life on Earth.
The changes that we fear are coming faster than anybody thought.
It's completely out of control.
Corporations have figured out there are really big business opportunities in these public sectors.
Private schools for the poor is a $51 billion a year market.
Take the education system, take the healthcare system.
That's a direct threat to democracy.
Their reach cannot be underestimated. They know everything about us.
If we don't push back, we're going to live in a world in which they are governing us privately through the profit motive.
One of the largest corporate bailouts with as few strings as possible in American history. Shameful.
Global pandemic. What do we do now? Let's do a tax cut.
The pandemic revealed that we need to contain corporate power.
The democracy is trying to breathe. We can't breathe because of the weight of poverty on our neck.
We have not come here to beg world leaders to care. Change is coming, whether you like it or not.
Are you actually going to challenge the power of corporations? This is what the 2020s will be about.
You have to really ask yourself, what was your role in this moment in history?
Absolutely amazing. Please welcome Jennifer Abbott and Avi Lewis.
Hi there.
Great to have you guys here.
Yes, thank you so much, Hans.
Thank you so much for these films. Congratulations on these films.
Thank you.
Incredibly important work. Now, before I hand it over to Jennifer and Avi, I'd just like to let those tuning in point you to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Right in the middle at the bottom is a Q&A icon. For questions for Avi and Jennifer, please type them into that little box, and Avi will be watching for that throughout the entire conversation. Type them in as we go. You may not get to all of them, but please put them in there and he'll be watching for them. Really looking forward to this conversation. Over to you, Jennifer and Avi. I'll see you at the end.
Thanks, Hans. So how does it feel to forget the technical experience? How does it feel to watch both of those trailers back to back? I don't know if you've had this experience yet. You're releasing two films at the same time. What the heck?
Yeah, what the heck? It wasn't supposed to be this way, that's for sure. The New Corporation was a film that never ended. I started Magnitude a lot earlier, and here they are. And no, I have never seen the two trailers back to back. It was pretty exciting and pretty gratifying, actually. Yeah.
So I guess you're finishing two films and launching them at the same time. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and today you and I are both in British Columbia, where Vancouver has the worst air quality on earth today, behind Portland. And so in this moment of crisis, you're launching these two films that you've been working on for years that are fundamentally about the intersecting crises that we face. Timing-wise, it feels right. But you didn't know this years ago when you started these projects, although these crises are not slow in the making. They are slow in the making. They've been with us forever.
Yeah, unfortunately, many of them have been with us for so long. I mean, I think if we look at the magnitude of all things, in particular, I started that film 6 years ago, and it's about, just to summarize, ecological grief, in particular related to the climate crisis. And when I first started that film, I would tell people I'm making a film about ecological grief, and honestly, they would look at me strangely. And it was a very surreal moment, without question, driving here today, because literally in Vancouver, you can hardly see across the road because of the smoke from the California and Washington state forest fires. So, you know, that issue honestly has been sidelined a little bit because we had a reprieve last year on the West Coast. We didn't have the smoky skies. We've been very focused on the pandemic, which of course is related, but that's a discourse that often gets ignored. So it was an extraordinarily surreal moment to come here today to do this when I felt deep ecological grief.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, as for the new corporation, you know, those, we call it the unfortunately necessary sequel. We didn't want to make this film, right? I mean, actually, I should speak for myself because my co-director Joel Bakken, he actually did want to make the film, and he wrote a brilliant book that accompanies the film called The New Corporation: Why Good Corporations Are Bad for Democracy. So he was sort of gung ho. Me, I had edited the first film in addition to co-directing it. You know, I cut that film from 400 hours of footage. And did I want to wrestle another monster of a film like that to the ground? No. But then Donald Trump was elected. And it's not that things really changed. It's more that the veil came down, right? And all of a sudden they were rigging the system right in front of our eyes. And then I felt compelled to undertake the sequel.
The films have collided in your life. And you and I talked a little bit personally, and you know, you've got 3 kids, we're all living through this surreal pandemic, and you're finishing 2 films. Finishing 1 film is enough to almost level any documentary filmmaker. So solidarity, huge compassion and solidarity for having pulled this
Thank
off
you.
and survived it, at least, you know, physically.
Ostensibly, I've survived. I'm actually in a million pieces. It takes a lot of energy to hold it all together.
Well, we'll see how much grief we can keep at bay with a little totally inappropriate lightheartedness in this conversation. So without going there the way the interviewer is supposed to try to make you cry as soon as possible, I was actually reflecting on this about whether or not the films started speaking to each other in your brain and in your heart over this past sort of year as they lurched to their respective conclusions.
Well, that's a really interesting question. I think, you know, for me, one of the most difficult things about making these 2 films at the same time was jumping in and out of both of them, because they are so different. And I think hopefully you'll see them, you might question that the same director is involved in both. So, you know, I think they're so complementary, especially in terms of obviously the issue of climate catastrophe, but they deal with such different aspects of the climate crisis that for me they're more complementary. And, you know, making them, that honestly, that it's interesting you honed in on that, because that was really one of the biggest challenges. Because when I'm making a film, probably you've had the same experience, you're so deep in it,
so
right?
inside it, completely inside it.
Exactly. And like you live, you breathe, you eat it, right? And to jump, and so I didn't sadly have that experience, because that would have been really nice to have the 2 films talk to each other. It was more disjointed than that, and I would go through sort of huge chunks of time where I'd be working on one and then the other and then the other, and of course sometimes at the same time. But yeah, I had to keep re-entering the zone of each, and that was difficult.
I think compartmentalization is a critical part of documentary filmmaking, of any filmmaking. In a way, even when you're editing scenes and you make a change that you hope changes the impact of a scene, you have to somehow reset your brain and watch it for the first time. And I've worked with editors who are incredibly good at this. I've worked on it. I think it is a muscle that you have to kind of exercise. It takes a huge amount of focus to watch something you've watched hundreds of times and try to see if the little change you made actually helped or not. But then you were doing that, maybe doing that with 2 films is the same muscle that you needed to put yourself into the reality of the new corporation or the magnitude of all things, and just be fully present in that, in those moments when you were working back and forth.
Yeah, well, it was actually this sort of segues and relates to the fact that with the new corporation, it's actually the first major film I made. I directed, that I didn't also edit. And heroic.
I'm not sure if it's happening for everyone, Jen, but you're breaking up pretty bad for me.
So it was very different for me in terms of review. Actually, the first time I had this luxury with an inspiration that I could.
Are you having trouble too, Hans?
Yeah, I think what
Hans is back. Is we're having trouble with your connection, Jennifer.
Jen, can you hear us?
Yeah.
I think what we should maybe do, Jen, is get you to log out and log back in.
You know what we could do? Why don't we play a clip from the film, which we were about to do anyway, and we'll give Jen a chance to log out and log back in. I mean, I blame Zoom. I think that should be obvious.
100%.
And I think we can beat up on Zoom later in the conversation because it'll be quite apropos. You'll see why. But Ryan, can we roll the first clip from the new corporation? Actually, it's in this clip. It's the logo montage one. Let's watch that and see if we can help Jennifer's connection. Ryan, if you can hear me, we want to roll that clip. There we go. Beautiful.
In the early 2000s, we made a film, The Corporation. We argued that large, publicly traded corporations are programmed relentlessly to pursue profit and growth and have become the dominant institutions of our time. We showed that the corporation is deemed by law to be a person, that it has the same rights as human beings, sometimes even more. So we posed the question, if the corporation is legally a person, what kind of person is it? We analyzed it the way a psychiatrist would analyze a patient. We found his character to be pathologically self-interested. Now with the world in crisis, climate change, spiraling inequality, a global pandemic, we re-examined the corporation, how it's changed, how it's changing our world, and how it's changing our very sense of who we are.
Another taste of the new corporation premiering at TIFF, or playing at TIFF in any event. Oh, Jen, you seem quite full motion. When does that ever work? Beautiful.
Okay,
So
I left and I came back. Sorry, I don't.
We just watched the first clip from the new corporation, and it's the one with the logo montage that ends after the alphabetical logos with Zoom, which is so perfect because it's the new bane of our existence and enabler of all of our at-home workaholism for those of us lucky enough to have comfortable homes to work from. So that clip does reference the first film, and making a sequel 17 years later, apart from the fact that we get to talk again after 17 years from our onstage conversation at TIFF in 2003, what were some of the challenges of a sequel at that delay?
Oh, that's interesting. You know, I don't know if, well, of course, many people at this point haven't seen the first film.
Right, then you have to kind of weave it in, right?
Yeah, so we, of course, we had to customize the film for people who have seen the first one and for people who hadn't. Then, of course, the pressure to live up to the first iteration. That was one of the reasons I actually really didn't want to do the sequel. The overriding reason was just like, no way, not another corporation film. So I think that is another thing, because I think there's, you know, I didn't want to go into the first film unless we had something really new and profound to add to the discourse. Mm-hmm. And as I said earlier, you know, for me, the moment where I went, yes, a sequel is necessary, is the moment that Trump was elected, just because then it was like, okay, this is urgent. We're really going to have to accelerate things. But 17 years later, perhaps one of the most difficult things is just the difference in the emotional place we were back then and that we are now. And so back then, there were big problems, but they felt salvageable, right? Like, even if we look at the climate crisis, it was a crisis, and it was probably an existential crisis then, but we didn't really acknowledge it as such. Now it's just a full-blown existential crisis, and that we can't stop, right? Like, we are too late. We can certainly prevent some of the most cataclysmic predictions, not all of them. We just have to look at the west coast of the United States to know that. But, I think that emotionally, it was just a different place. It was a place of greater possibility. And now I think, because of the last 17 years and the exponential development of all of these existential crises that we documented in the first film, plus additional ones, like, the outsized power of big tech.
Right.
It's just a different place. And so if you when you see the sequel, you'll see that it actually has more gravitas than the first film. We're a little more cheeky with the first film.
Yeah, there was more playfulness, and yeah. You had such a brilliant conceit that Joel Bakken developed in the first book and the first film, that it was like a personality test, a psychological evaluation of the corporation. Turns out it's a sociopath. It's a psychopathic entity. And in this one, there's more. I think there's more. It's more accepted with a longer record of that kind of behavior. And as you said, the Trump years have put things that were already on a trajectory into hyperdrive. I got the feeling in the film of the speed of life in 2020. You told me there were 1,100 archival clips in the film. How was it to wrangle? I know you didn't edit the new corporation, but wrangling the sheer quantity of material was a challenge in the first film and a different one in the second film, with new technologies and new ways of managing.
Sorry, I'm just trying to.
We're having trouble again.
Okay.
Can you hear me, Jen? Nobody breathe. We may have to do this rhythmically, just like you just leave and come back, leave and come back.
Not very well.
Because we're having the same problem as before. We have two films to draw from. Okay, good. Okay, don't move. Good.
Okay.
So my question was, how was it to navigate the sheer amount of material, especially archival material, and the number of chapters and examples and scenes that you strung together, I thought, incredibly fluidly in the new corporation?
Well, it's very similar to the first film in the sense that, when you're making a film about the dominant institution at the time, the problem isn't so much what to include, it's like what not to include. Like it's almost like we could include anything, and not only anything about the world, but anything about, from inside our bodies to outer space. Like, sadly, the hegemony of the corporation is such that it's almost everywhere. So, I think it was very challenging in the sense that with the corporation films now, as you'll note, we structure our narrative arc with primarily interviews from extraordinary thinkers and corporate insiders, philosophers, all kinds of activists. And then we sort of find ways to illustrate this. Ultimately the stories they tell, but how the stories as they substantiate the ideas of our essay documentary, right? And so, I have to credit again our editor, Peter Rowick, for a lot of the extraordinary footage he found and put together, which is what I did for the first film. And I will say we had 1,100 stock clips in the new corporation. And Kate Lingley was our archival researcher, and Betsy Carson and Trish Dahlman are our producers. And I tell you, what a nightmare in terms of copyright clearance.
Yeah.
But they were so, but I think in terms of weaving it all together and making it feel like it flows, like for me, that's sort of something that I've worked on and with for a long time now. Mm-hmm. And I'm pretty ruthless, to tell you the truth. It's like, okay, tangent out, yep. Right? And it's like, okay, we want to go to this idea, but they started with it instead of ended with it. Let's reorder, right? And so I think people would be quite shocked. Like I can, for the first film, like just how never ever did we misrepresent anyone. Absolutely not. And we also very, very conscious about not editorializing, like not hanging somebody, letting them hang themselves, right?
Yeah, that I remember you did a few times, but yeah.
Oh, I think they hung themselves, but anyway.
Yeah, exactly. You gave them plenty of rope in the first film. I remember it well.
Exactly. So, I think people would be quite like, as anyone who is an editor and can look at a timeline of just how much things are shredded so that they flow seamlessly. And so that, if ever there's a tangent, as important as that tangent might be, it disrupts the narrative flow. So it's got to go. Right.
I think it really is. It's with essay films in particular, where you're dealing with, you don't have plot devices, and there are a couple of sequences that are sort of character driven in the film, but you don't have an arc that is truly emotional. You have an arc of ideas, and you fill in emotion with music and other elements, but essentially you've got to keep people on the edge of their seat with a through line of ideas, which I think is, and you specialize in essay films, and we're going to get to Magnitude any second now, which is a very personal essay film.
Yes.
But I think that the ruthlessness is an interesting quality to consider in how you streamline a narrative arc of ideas. Mm-hmm. And then is the archival, there's a lot of edits with 1,100 archival clips in the film. The editing is fast, although it never, to me, feels gratuitously so. Are you mostly constructing a talk line, an idea arc, and then illustrating it? Is that more or less the process? This is a filmmakery question that we occasionally get to indulge in.
Yes, absolutely. And I love those questions. Absolutely. I can speak with the corporation films because I edited and co-directed the first one with Mark Akbar. I'll say that, I drove Mark, who was co-directing, crazy, because for a whole year, I was like, nope, we're not dealing with that now. I would only work with any footage that could inform the narrative arc. So yes, some stock footage, if it did so, I would, but if it was purely illustrative, no way. We had to find the story. We had not only the story in terms of content, but absolutely, maybe even more importantly, the emotional arc of the film, right? Mm-hmm. And so you're absolutely right. That's the way I primarily construct a film when I'm starting is, let's find that arc. Often, but not exclusively, that comes from interviews.
Yeah.
And then once, obviously it's going to be longer than the final film, because then we start working with visuals and sound. Like, I did the sound design on Magnitude and another film, and I always, as an editor, bring in sound so early, right? Yeah. And I love sound. So it's then afterwards, once you found that story arc, that emotional arc, that you start working with visuals. That's mostly my process.
That's really interesting, and it actually speaks to a long-held prejudice of mine, that you'll bring in sound and maybe many layers of sound design or temp music or other effects early in a cut, and hold off visual wallpapering until very late in the process. Because the thing is that it's sound that actually drives emotion, Nobody
Yes.
ever cried in a movie theater because of an image that they saw. It's something that's communicated to them through the soundtrack that really moves you
Yeah.
right here.
So do you do the same thing? Do you bring in sound really early too, or?
I do, and I think about it from the beginning. And for me, even at a rough cut stage, there are parts of the film, critical emotional beats that will be sold. We'll work with a test audience because of the sound, really, the picture, and we're much more forgiving, I think, as viewers with picture, especially in the earlier parts of the cell phone video age, when we got used again to seeing pretty rough footage in lots of different kinds of pieces. That was another thing about the new corporation, was the extraordinary quality and smoothness of all that stock footage. I mean, it was like, and it seemed to have a similarity. I think that was a masterful technical accomplishment to make it feel of a piece despite zillions of sources. Was that mostly in the edit, would you say, or in post, or in both?
Well, I think it was mostly in post. Although, I started to, I think we, again, Joel Bakken, my co-director, and the editor, Peter Roy.
The editor, yeah.
Yeah, we were so relieved when we found Peter, because it's like, I don't, it's like, who are we going to get to cut this? And I was like, no way, not me. Yeah, I think it was really largely in post. But there's a relationship, obviously, between those scenes that feel really coherent and content, right? Yeah. And so there has to be sort of a foundational narrative story, I think, to hold a scene together, and sound, as you mentioned, right? And then all of those things provide, I think, coherence. And it was a challenge, though, creating cohesive segments, for sure, because we didn't want viewers to, it's already a very complex film and quite a difficult film. And I think we didn't want viewers to feel really frenetic as they watched it, because it's a difficult, like that's a you don't want to come to a film like this emotionally from a place of feeling completely disjointed.
Yeah, or overwhelmed. For what it's worth, as a viewer, having watched it a couple of times, I felt that the pacing of it was utterly digestible and really comfortable, which is key, because I think there's a huge sort of public education component in the film, which I believe will be used for many years. But I want to turn to the magnitude of all things.
You know what? Before we do, I just have to actually give a shout out to Velcro Ripper, who did the sound design, and Matt Robertson, who was our extraordinary composer. They both did. Seeing as we were talking about TNC and sound, I can't depart from that place without really commending both of them. They contributed so hugely.
You can hear it in the clips. And that's the part that Zoom doesn't tend to screw up as badly.
No.
So we appreciate the sound work immensely. So we've got two films that we can talk about that you're launching simultaneously. And I think we could pull this off. Can we checkerboard the structure of this conversation?
Sure, absolutely, absolutely.
So let's bounce back and forth as we would with storylines in our fine cut. And I want to turn to The Magnitude of All Things, which in my view is the first major film on the subject of climate grief on Earth. And I think a work of immense importance and power. As someone who, since my last film came out in 2015, I've given my life to just switched right over to activism on the subject of climate and racism and inequality and those intersecting crises. This film was very, very powerful and beautiful to watch, and felt really needed, really necessary, because climate grief is a feeling that more and more people, unfortunately, are becoming acquainted with. And without a space and a place to confront it, to name it, to let ourselves feel it and connect around it, so we figure out how to go on while we carry this immense burden, now compounded by pandemic, fear of death on every front from so many different sources. I felt that this work was profound and comes at just the right time. So I want to share a little taste of it beyond the trailer, which moves at a different pace from the film itself. And we're going to play the first clip, which is the introduction. Is there anything you want to set up, or should we just roll it? And then we can start talking about how you put the film together.
Yeah, let's just roll it, sure.
All right, Ryan, you ready?
Thank you. Thank you.
This is how I remember it beginning. It was the middle of a hot, dry summer. There's a light breeze. The sky is a dramatic orange. And it's snowing. Except it isn't snow at all. It's ash from a distant forest fire fueled by climate change. I'm not sure what surprised me more, the ash falling with careless grace, or the feeling that rose up within me as it fell. It was grief. I knew it well. And this time, it was for the changing world all around me.
An early clip from The Magnitude of All Things. Jennifer's taken this moment wisely to log out and log back in. Well done, Jen. There you are.
I'm having technical issues.
20, you got like, we're getting you in 22, 23 frames a second. So I'll make a confession. I watched both the films a couple of times. I made lots of notes during The New Corporation. And when I started watching The Magnitude of All Things for the first time, I just got lost in the film. And I got to the end of it and I'd only written one thing down on my notebook, but it was this. What is the role of beauty in a film about grief? It is a very beautiful film. And I have a chance now to ask you that question.
Wow, that is such a great question. So yeah, actually the first thing that comes to me is that, you know, part of life is obviously death, right? And when we lose, that is when we experience grief. But as a culture, we tend to push that side of life death. Like I practice Zen Buddhism, and we just consider life death one. And so we tend to push the death side away, right? And yet it is really just one. And if we see it as just one and reclaim it as part of ourselves, as part of the whole, then there's such beauty there. And for me, you know, The Magnitude of All Things is not only about death, it's about life. And life has such exquisite beauty. And not only that, you know, the world that we're losing, sadly, in who knows, let's hope that we find a way to stop the trajectory we're on towards an unlivable planet. But if we consider the beauty, I mean, I wanted just to represent that which we were losing in its full magnitude, right? In its full beauty, in its full awe-dropping power, right? And that it, and actually, you know, in terms of the visuals, it also, I tried to give the earth a voice in terms of sound design. So that's a part of it as well. So, you know, that's I was going several places with that. I think it's such an interesting question. And ultimately, you know, to be more concise in its answer is to represent that which we are losing in its full beauty, but also to acknowledge that maybe culturally we have it wrong, you know, that our focus exclusively on life and especially youth, right, really means that we cut a whole part of ourselves off. And so just to represent the hopefully like truth and beauty and poetry and in its full in its full magnitude again, it was something I really wanted to do.
Amazing. And I think this is one of the ways that we can deal with grief on a cosmic scale, is to find a language for it, and it demands new art forms, I think. And I think this is what I think this is the first major attempt. So for the audience that hasn't seen the film, and we've gotten a little taste of it and there are hints of it, you lost your sister to cancer, and then years later decided to make a film about grief, connecting your own personal loss and the climate crisis. And I didn't want to lead with this because I think it's sort of, I think you and I have talked a little bit that it's a bit of a hard sell. And the film does a much better job than a conversation would about the connections between those things. But I guess the voice of your sister through her letters is a very powerful character and force in the film. Can you tell us a little bit about the material that you were left with after your sister's passing that informed the genesis of the film?
Absolutely. So my sister died in 2008, and she was an extraordinary woman who had done so much personal work, and actually even was conscious of the fact that she could teach me something through her about life through her death. And so, you know, I was privileged enough to go through that journey with her, and she wrote those letters as she was walking this line that is so difficult to walk when you have an illness that could be terminal, between, on the one hand, fighting for life, which you want so badly, but also surrendering to what is, right? And so she was really able to walk that line so beautifully. And just a little segue, you know, that's what we kind of have to do with climate crisis, right? Right. But so she wrote these beautiful letters, not just to myself, but to my family and her closest friends. And she actually asked me to do something with them.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Like just a couple days before she died, she asked me to do something with them. And I didn't know what I would do. And certainly for several years, I didn't know. But it was, you know, I know you played the beginning clip. I missed it because of tech issues, but
you might remember it fairly well.
I remember it fairly well, yes. But it was precisely that moment when I mistook the ash for snow, and I recognized this emotion as grief about the world, and then different in intensity but similar in tenor. Oh, that is the experience of grief when I lost my sister. So that was, as it is in the film, that was precisely the moment that I had the idea to make this film, which was a very tough sell. It's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny. A lot of people in the chat are asking about how it was raising money for the new corporation. You know, given the success of the first film. And actually, and with respect to those people, and I want you to incorporate that in your answer, I'm much more interested in how you raised money for the magnitude of all things, because like it is not an easy pitch. I'll share a brief anecdote to give you time to think of how you want to manage these things. When I was trying to get distribution for This Changes Everything, after we'd got into TIFF, and so the way is kind of paved, at least the film is going to get some kind of mainstream launch. I had the head of a distribution company, which is a smaller one, but like legendary. Everybody wanted to work with this guy. This is like the company. And I guess I'll preserve whatever small bit of a documentary future there is for myself by not naming. But after he blew us off at a meeting at TIFF and like finally showed up, you know, 2 hours later, his response to the film about the climate crisis and the surging movement in 2015 that was rising up to confront it was, maybe we package it as something else. I mean, maybe it's like could be a horror film, could be a genre film, could be like I'm like, the film is kind of about community responses, like frontline communities on the, you know, on the climate. He's like, yeah, but nobody wants, no one wants to talk about that. It could be packaged as anything. Like literally the schmuck is telling me this stuff. But
Yeah.
I was not pitching a film about the death of all things.
Yes.
So how the hell did you manage to get this film funded? And any comparing and contrasting with the new corporation would be welcomed by the valiant audience members who have asked this question.
Okay, well, let's deal with that part first, because I was literally absolutely uninvolved in the funding process for the new corporation. And I have to give complete credit to our producers, Betsy Carson and Trish Dolman, and Joel Backen also came in and certainly raised some funds too. So I think, though, you know, obviously with the success of the first film and its reputation, there's already a door open to it, right? So not that it was, you know, and also that was a film that would just never end because we kept having to go back and open picture lock. So then Betsy and Trish kept having to raise more and more money, and Joel as well. So I probably can't speak that authoritatively. I mean, I obviously know how it was funded, but I didn't participate in the fundraising for it. But for The Magnitude of All Things, it was really hard, without question. And because not only is it about cancer and climate change, yes, it's very, very tough sell. My process is very, you know, I experiment a lot while I go. You know, I have a very, very clear vision, but I'm not always, and I love writing, so that's not an issue, but it was more, I don't always know exactly how a film is going to take shape prior to making it. You probably have that same experience.
Hold on, your pitch materials are supposed to describe the entire thing before you've made it.
Exactly, yes, exactly. So how do you do that?
Right.
So, you know, I think there were those two things, but I think I'm probably more process oriented perhaps than most filmmakers, but maybe not. So I was lucky enough so Shirley Veracruz from the National Film Board on the West Coast did, you know, believe in the project early on. So we got development funds early on from the NFB. Mm-hmm. And then I was able to have a private investor come on for just a very small amount of money. I mean, in terms of development, what we're talking about is, you know, less than 50 grand or so, like not a lot of money in terms of filmmaking. And then, so I sort of got the ball rolling. I was able to do a demo trailer, get some treatments in place. And then lucky enough to bring Andrew Williamson and Henrik Meyer on board as producers. And things accelerated, and we applied to the TELUS Fund, which they came back to us, and you know, we kind of knew it was one of our only sources of major funding that we might get. And they came back to us and said, well, what if we were to give you half of the amount you asked for? And we're like, nope, we need it all. And they came back and they gave us their max.
Gutsy maneuver.
Yep.
Good for you.
So that was good.
And
then,
negotiating tips, people.
Yeah, we were like, no, we cannot
Don't settle.
This with that. Yeah. You know, and then Telefilm came on board, and so, you know, but I honestly, I have to again credit mostly other people for Magnitude other than the initial, and of course I was involved, but Andrew and Henrik were instrumental in securing the funds, and Shirley at the NFB has been a real champion of the film. So, but it was a long haul to raise that money. And actually we don't even have it all yet. Like we've all deferred part of our salaries.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think my last film that came out now 5 years ago, I think we're almost there. I think we've almost, I think just another 15 or 20 grand still to raise. Yeah.
This is not my quote, but it's somebody is like, how do you raise $1 million as a documentary filmmaker? You start with 2 million, right?
Well, but then I mean, it was not a small film. Then you went around the world. The film takes place in the Amazon. It takes place in the far north. It takes place in Australia, and then you also had this extraordinary. Dream sequences, reenactment sequences, memory sequences, which to me looked like they were shot like a feature film, like a narrative feature. So it was a really ambitious scope of the film. Did you? What was the biggest struggle having that many shoots, locations, strands? Was it the money, being able to get out there and actually capture those storylines? Was it wrangling all of the different chapters into a whole? What was the hardest thing about the sprawlingness of it?
Right. I mean, I don't think it was the money, because we did have in place the money we need. I mean, we were really smart with our money. Like, nothing drives me crazier than being frivolous with money. That, like, I think we used
There's
our
the
money
Jennifer Abbott ruthlessness
so well.
again.
Yes, that's right.
Nope, story tangent, snip out, extra hotel room, don't need it.
Stuff like that, exactly. So, you know, we were really smart with our money, and we had it in place for production. But you know what I think was the hardest thing was, it was grueling. We you know, so in 2019 we filmed in 4 continents, and, you know, around 10 climate front lines, and it went from, you know, my field producer and stills photographer Stacia Garraway and I, who's a beloved friend, you know, desperately, you know, we went from being in Australia, walking through like literally monsoon rains. It was +40 monsoon rains. You actually felt like you were walking through a shower, but thankfully, you know, no, not thankfully, but it was +40, so you weren't cold. Very bizarre experience. But we went from that to -35 in Nunavut, and like being on a you know, snowmobile, and like looking behind us, is because that's the only way you can get around there, and like looking behind, and holy, we've just fallen partly through the ice on this snowmobile, you know, and just like going from +40 to -35, and just the, you know, it was just because it, you know, when I'm on set, of course you know, I give my heart and soul to it. Like, you have to just be so present, and so and you're taking care of everybody, but in addition to trying to you know, manifest this vision you have. So it's very, very taxing on me. I'm also like quite an introvert, so I'm not you know, I'm sort of half and half. I like my alone time, and none of that did I get, right? So I think it was just very, very grueling for our DOP Vince Arvidsson, and our sound recordist Ramsey Busquet. So, but we were a great team, and I so appreciated traveling around the world with them. But we actually had to cancel a shoot. We did all these shoots, and then Greta, you know, Greta's team responded to us that we could film with her this day and this day only. So we had to like turn everything around.
Yep.
Yeah, and then do Extinction Rebellion London, that same shoot. But after that, we were just so spent. We actually had to postpone a few shoots. It was really just, it took a lot out of us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was it a blessing in the end that you had to give up some of the? Do you think that you had to give up some of the planned storylines?
Because you know, I'm temporally and spatially challenged, and I think I'm, you know, I also just like, I mean, this is a feature documentary, and even as it is, we had to cut some beautiful people and beautiful scenes, right? So yes, I think it was probably a blessing, and that we really did have our film already. And I mean, as you know, right, a film never ends. You just sort of, it just is wrestled from you. You said, no, you can't work on it anymore. And so, yeah, that's what happened. Yes.
All right. I want to go back to the new corporation, because I think these subjects are increasingly going to converge in our conversation. And I'd like to roll another clip to bring us into this. Someone in the Q&A has asked us to connect the dots between climate change and the pandemic. And the pandemic does reside within the frame of the new corporation. I know that you extended, you know, the first time you unlocked the picture was because the pandemic was descending and you needed to,
Yeah.
you knew you needed to include that. And the film does connects those subjects well. But they also are connected in the magnitude of all things in, I think, a more elliptical way, because the pandemic doesn't reside within the film itself. But it surely is about the feelings that the pandemic is bringing up and the recognitions that it's affording us all. And a lot of this now, like this conversation itself, is being filtered through big tech. And they are the new corporate giants, and they are cashing in massively on the pandemic as everything like this is going online. And so I want to play this clip from the new corporation and then come back and talk a little bit about the subject of big tech and how it's making out like a big bandit on the new crises. Ryan, if you're ready, it's clip 5 from the new corporation.
Great.
Corporations have decided that they should remake education by using technology. They want to have teacherless classrooms. But the teacher is the single most important and expensive part of education. In the tech industry's dream, if the teacher is removed from the equation, then you can cut costs dramatically.
These companies monopolize everything. First of all, monopolize their sector, and the next thing is to look where's left. These giant corporations are frantically searching for new sources of profit because it's drying up. They say, we need to take the education system, take the healthcare system, take the transport system, and own it, or we die.
Silicon Valley is the new Rome of our time. The Valley has become this extraordinary power center that has a huge say over what kind of media and information we have in a democracy, over, frankly, how many of our biggest problems are solved, over how election campaigns are run, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Technology is neutral, and in many ways it's great. But there's a difference between the technology and allowing a few powerful players to manipulate it for their own ends. So we've gone from this wide open world that opened up all of these possibilities for people to create things, to share information, to share ideas, and it has collapsed into these walled gardens that are controlled by a few very powerful players.
We're seeing Amazon, for example, gobbling up every kind of business in sight. They're interested in getting into pharmaceuticals, and they're making a big move into food.
They capture about half of everything that Americans spend online. And they're growing into all these different directions. They control 35% of the world's cloud computing capacity. They're building out shipping and logistics infrastructure that is scaled to take on the Postal Service and UPS. And increasingly, they are the intermediary for all of our smart devices. Alexa, their voice system, is 70% of the market. And on it goes. They're making investments in finance, in healthcare, hit movies and television shows. Amazon is increasingly setting the rules for what happens in its marketplace and pretending like that's a real market, but of course it's not. That's a direct threat to democracy, a very fundamental threat to democracy.
Though elected by no one, corporations are now starting to be treated like governments.
We're joined now live by the world's first ever tech ambassador. Can I start simply by asking you, what exactly does a tech ambassador do?
Well, we're basically trying to treat the technology and the tech companies in a way which is similar to the way we treat a bilateral relationship with countries all over the world. The value of their stocks is more or less the same as the GDP of France. And we think that that is being translated into influence over political affairs. We think it is necessary to treat them in a way which is similar to the way we treat other countries.
A lot of folks in the Valley believe that the companies they are building are kind of replacements of government. I think if we don't push back against the kind of agenda that these companies have, we're going to live in a world in which they are governing us privately through the profit motive, but governing us.
Another clip from the new corporation. I think the ascendancy of big tech must have been one of the reasons why a sequel was necessary, because we do live in a totally new landscape of corporate giants.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I think if we go back to an earlier conversation in terms of what is salvageable now, like and we talked about, obviously we can't completely stop climate change. And I think it's a question, can we completely stop the outsized power of high tech, given its ascendancy and given that it is not regulated in a way that would constrict its power? So we're sort of in this situation where it has so much power, governments which are really the only institution that can control big tech, at least as they exist today.
For sure.
They do not have the power that they need to control big tech, and it's another existential crisis, and it is one that would have, unlike the other crises that we talk about in the film. I shouldn't laugh because it's not funny, but it's almost the absurdity of having to deal with so many crises, and it's really sad. It's where we are. It's where we are. So it's perhaps with the outsized power of high tech, it is perhaps, but not as predetermined as climate change. Perhaps it's another crises that we don't have enough of a handle on to actually be able to stop. And are we going to be, what kind of world are we going to be living in? I mean, what kind of world are we already living in?
I so hope you're wrong about that. I do believe that governments have really been seduced by big tech and bought and purchased as they have been. There are so many cultural factors, like the enduring hold of the fossil fuel industry on governments, particularly our own in Canada. Even when they speak lovely words about addressing the climate crisis, we see they continue to support and subsidize, spend tens of billions of dollars buying pipelines and other commitments to the fossil fuel industry, which is not even as major an employer in the country as it is in people's imaginations. And these industries are very skillful at manipulating those cultural factors. And big tech has surely presented itself as so progressive and so green and so future looking that too many politicians are simply seduced, especially those like in our country that are kind of easily impressed by celebrity. I feel like watching The New Corporation, these points are made really well about big tech, not just in a scare you kind of way, but in a way that helps us see the extent of it. Do you remember the clip that you ended up using of Naomi Klein, my partner upstairs, in the original Corporation? It was, I'm sure she was talking about, from her work on No Logo in 2000, how the dream of the new corporation, of the corporation in the 2000s, was for people to live inside their brands. And at that point, it meant like Nike superstores and like the retail experience. Now we're freaking living inside these boxes. And with big tech, we really are living inside their world. A huge amount of our working lives right now.
Yes. And I mean, what we try to do with The New Corporation is just sort of spell it out, right? Like, it's so easy to be entranced and seduced by technology and by the really trivial, small comforts that they provide us, whether or not we can just order food and it shows up on our door 15 minutes later or whatever, right? And so, what are we really want to ask the question, what are we giving up when we basically just give our lives to them? And I just wish there were more people who were really, I mean, I have 13-year-old teenagers, right, and twin daughters. They're actually in the magnitude of all things. And being a parent today too, it's like, and I mean, it's not as if they haven't grown up with these conversations. It's just so difficult. It's such a behemoth it's so it's a problem that is very difficult to convince people of, really. And I think that the one story we do have in the new corporation, which actually does for the most part elicit the kind of almost nausea that we want it to, is the privatization of education and the role of high tech in that endeavor. And we feature Bridge International Academies, who are going into countries in Africa and elsewhere and taking over and taking resources from public education, so the governments of those countries, and funneling them into these private schools, these charter schools rather, that are, and this whole model is being financed by Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates, right?
Yeah.
And then, and they actually, how they make a profit is by substituting qualified teachers with tablet people who have tablets, who are not teachers, but they literally read the curriculum to these students on these tablets, insofar as walk 2 steps towards the blackboard, spend individual time with a student. Like, this is their instruction. They're reading from a tablet that is constructed in Silicon Valley. And like one of our interviewees says, this is colonialism, pure and simple, and without question it is. And so I think it's a really powerful and strong example, and dear to the heart of my co-director Joel Bakken to have included. He wrote a book on education and children. So, I think it's an example of sort of the insidiousness, the colonial nature, like, really imposing all of these values onto the world from Silicon Valley, right, of high tech. And it's very scary, and I think it's a great example, as I say, that sort of elicits the kind of emotional reaction we want it to, because it often is really hard to convince people of the sort of the destructive side of technology. Yes, there are great sides of technology, and if we could use it democratically in the service of democracy and the public good, great. But that's not how it's being used.
And this is a really interesting moment around the pandemic, where big tech companies are, the number of billions of dollars a day that Jeff Bezos is making during the pandemic, it's truly shocking. But at the same time, this is a time when a lot of the playbook, and you have a literal playbook in the new corporation of the corporate economic agenda, has been deeply discredited and kind of abandoned temporarily in certain ways. Like, when there's a disaster, people want the government to step in. And in Canada, we had a $30 billion deficit, which there was already a big drumbeat about the Liberals spending selling the store. It's gone up by 10 times in 6 months. The federal deficit is now $300 billion. And there are very few people who dare to say this is the crisis, because the crisis is people are dying of a pandemic and the economy is in stasis because businesses can't operate. And we accept that the government, this is why we have governments. So there are opportunities here to reassert the role of government. Maybe regulating and controlling big tech would be one of them, providing public services rather than services for profit. And I think this gets wrapped up quite nicely in the new corporation as a really clear call for the value of the public as an antidote. And the pandemic, although it is a disaster capitalism opportunity of historic proportions, has also been a big reminder, has it not, of what needs to be public. We have a functioning public healthcare system in Canada that is attempting to grapple with the pandemic, and you can see what it looks like in the country to the south that doesn't.
Yes,
so I feel like the pandemic is such a teacher for both of these films.
Yes, I think these are really important Observations, absolutely. And I had a moment when I was looking at the New York Times map that was mapping out cases per capita of COVID-19. And, you know, the red of the high cases stops at the border. And then it's in Alaska. And of course, COVID-19 knows no borders. The only thing that is different is public policy, right? And the actions of government. So for me, it was such a visual example of exactly what you're talking about.
Yes. We're a nice light yellow for all that it's hard and terrifying out there, and it's not an angry red.
Yes, and not an angry red. And I'm really happy that you raised this point, because without question, it was an absolutely essential sort of thread throughout the film, where we, you know, start by looking at the, you know, 40 years ago with Reagan, Thatcher, Friedman, you know, the rise of neoliberalism and the dissing of government and making government the enemy, and, you know, shrinking it as much as possible. And, you know, if you really think about that, it's a very, very, it's a very explosive and difficult ideological overlay onto the idea of democracy, right? Like, obviously democracy is never perfect. It's always aspirational, but we have to hold on to that aspiration, because in its best, government does work on behalf of people and for the people, of the people, by the people. And absolutely within the film, we were trying to say, hey, we've been conned, right? Like, we've totally been conned into thinking that, into giving up on government. And in these years now where we're facing such big problems, like, who are we going to really rely on to solve these problems? And I'm not suggesting like government the best government. Like, there's obviously evil and corrupt and horrible governments, and many governments who are captured by big business, which is also one of the huge problems. Mm-hmm. So, thanks for picking up on that thread, because it is a major theme in our film, where we're trying to reassert the role of government in society to work for the common good. And, you know, we profile several progressives who are elected to government who aren't at the behest and tied to big corporate interests. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm.
I think it is also, I think, in a slightly less literal way, a subject of concern for the magnitude of all things, which is, how does change happen when we are in what now looks like perpetual, overlapping, and nested crises, none of which are going anywhere, all of which compound each other, and then how do we not just give up? And I think this is for me, the central question of our time. And I don't feel defeated, and, you know, on a daily basis, we find ways to continue to struggle for change. But in the magnitude of all things, it becomes a deeply personal question of how you confront the loss of nature, the loss of everything, the loss of your loved ones, and things burning, incinerating around us, as you and I are looking out the window at a complete whiteout with wildfire smoke, you know, on this day. And so I want to return to a more artistic approach to these massive questions, and spend a little time with you in the magnitude of all things by rolling another clip, and then return to these themes in that light. Does that sound okay?
That sounds great, thanks.
Ryan, let's roll the next clip from the magnitude of all things.
That's one rule. People believe that Lizard is crying. I mean, she's up high and she can see she's crying for all the environmental issues.
Out over there, you can see everything.
Yeah.
There's great big cans of just eating everything, eating our country up, just destroying our country. Our people lived in the mountains there, and well, they shot us out, poisoned us and that. They're not doing that today, but it's not much different. It's just the same thing. We've just been brought down. We're still nothing. We're still nothing.
This land and us, Lizard Rock, the trees, the river, we're all just one. And if this land hurts, we hurt.
Si sacáramos todos los recursos naturales de Amazonía, es como destruir nuestro corazón, nuestro sentimiento, nuestra forma de ser como humanos.
His name is Samaro, a word that is from the Zapara language that means one energy. One energy that has been always there in the universe, in the galaxies, on planet Earth. I have a lot of fear of what is going to happen in his lifetime because the time is ending for humans. For animals, for the forest. And in my dreams, all this information is coming from my dreams, and I don't want to see it.
Another beautiful clip from The Magnitude of All Things. Jen, I wanted to play that clip because it gives a sense of how you drift from place to place in the film and how these very different storylines and characters thread together. But also because there is a deep theme in The Magnitude of All Things, which is dealt with explicitly in the new corporation itself. And this is the clearest connecting point between the two films, which is our relationship with nature. Mm-hmm. Which I thought came through in that clip very beautifully. Do you want to talk a little bit about how, first of all, in Magnitude, how that theme was essential for you in making the film and how you explored it, how you approached it?
Yeah, I mean, this is likely the most important issue that's like the closest to my heart in terms of exploring, and I explore in all my work because I just feel like we've got it so wrong, you know, in terms Western culture, in terms of defining who we are as humans and our place within the natural world and our relationship to non-human animals. And you know, it's something that like it's something that hurts me a lot, you know, and always, you know, my first feature documentary was actually about factory farming. And when I first learned about factory farming, when I was like, you know, you're told certain things about the way food comes to you. And then when I first learned about it, I was like, really, I was so, but I felt so betrayed and so hurt, and also just hurt so badly, you know, for all of the non-human animals we were in effect torturing, really. And so, but of course, the same would be the case for our disregard for non-human animals generally, right? And so, and the natural world, and that we prioritize, like, I just don't understand the point of view that can look at a clear-cut mine or the tar sands, or, you know, we can go on and go, and who can think that's okay? Like, I don't really understand it. And so in all of my work, I really, that's an underlying theme, and certainly within the corporation, the new corporation, and magnitude, it's a big theme. So, as I said earlier, you know, I actually, when I was making the sound design, tried to work with the voice of the earth, and there's sounds that, like,
you mentioned that before. Give me nerd out for me and tell me how you did that. What you did and how you did it.
Well, I think I you know, reached really deeply and tried to experiment and connect with sounds. Like, what is it sound like to be the earth and, you know, exploded, or
in pain,
or a tree that's 1,000 years old cut down, or, you know, whatever it might be, right? And so yeah, it's I'm really happy you picked up on that, because it's something very, very important to me, and important in all my work. And with the new corporation, it was absolutely essential that when we opened the cut up, you know, there were all kinds of issues that related to the pandemic that we touch upon. But, you know, for me, one of the most important is a very neglected narrative, which links the destruction of the natural world by, to a large extent, corporate capitalism, our complete disregard of non-human animals, to emerging zoonotic diseases, which are diseases, as we know, which transfer from non-human animals to animals. And there's just a very, very direct link there that a lot of people don't know about, that I think it's really important that they do.
Yeah, that's a clip in the new corporation that I don't think we'll get to, but I'm really glad you described it. And there's someone, I think, named Nicola Cole, who's been asking in the chat for a while for us to connect the dots directly between the pandemic and the climate crisis, apart from the fact that they're happening simultaneously. I think this point of yours is the point of connection.
Yes.
How do you see these two crises as connected?
Sure. Well, so for example, if we were to take, so let's just look at a forest. We cut down a forest, and there were bats living in that forest. And those bats, therefore, have lost that habitat, and they're driven elsewhere, and likely in closer contact to humans. And then there's the opportunities for a transfer of diseases that live in those bats but are harmless to them, to make their way. And it can be directly to humans, but it can also have an intermediary host of another non-human animal. Frequently, by the way, these are in animals that are in industrial agribusiness. So basically, these emerging diseases are jumping from non-human animal to eventually to humans, and that is related to the destruction of the natural world. It's all, you know, and of course it's related to the climate crisis, because as ecosystems heat, or there's drought, or there's fires, or whatever it may be, non-human animals will migrate, and there's less and less space for them, and again they will come into closer contact with humans. And there's other things as well that I'm sure you can speak to, just in terms of where insects live, right? Like, you know, mosquitoes we know are a huge transfer insect for diseases. And if their habitats are shifting because the climate is shifting, then those diseases will migrate with the mosquitoes. So, I mean, this is obviously a big subject, and we could discuss for a long time, but it's a very important thing to know. And we actually even have a headline in the new corporation, which is, halt the destruction of nature or face more pandemics. Yeah. And I don't think that's a fanciful statement. I think that's scientific consensus.
There you go. We're drawing to the end of our time, and we have a little joke around here that the hope question is always saved, for the end. And too often the host will say, "So what gives you hope? You have 30 seconds." And I feel like I'm kind of doing that, but in the subject, in the question of these two works, in a much more sophisticated way, and take as many seconds as you need, because this is a big one. The subject of hope in a film about grief and loss, and how to properly grieve the loss of the natural world and the loss of all things, as well in the subject of the corporation and the unbelievable power of corporations to usurp the public and to extract from all of us. Neither film feels in any way hopeless to me. And I want to say that really, really clearly as a viewer, to you and to the audience for both films. In the new corporation, it isn't just swelling music and crowds in the streets. There's a deeper analysis of a new generation of politicians and social movement leaders, politicians like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and other insurgent characters who come out of social movement organizing, who go into the electoral sphere and remain in dialogue with the movements that put them there. And this connection between social movements and the electoral sphere is where the new corporation finds some genuine hope towards the end of it. And in the magnitude, and I think that's just advanced straightforwardly as the thesis of the film, one of the ideas. In the magnitude of all things, you end up saying, where does hope reside? And this notion of your own recognition about hope that the film and the process gave you. And I'd love you to share that, as it's a very personal one, and for me was a real landing point for the work in the subject of how these films about really hopeless battles actually end up giving you kernels of hope, but not of a kind of a cliched kind, of a really genuine, authentic kind.
Yeah, when I was making The Magnitude of All Things, and you probably have experienced this yourself with your climate film and activism, that hope itself can be a form of denial, right? Because we think everything's going to be okay, and then we delegate responsibility to others. It can. So I really identified hope as it's possible that it could be a form of denial. Before I get to the magnitude of all things, I want to say something that I feel is so important with regards to the new corporation, that yes, you outlined the groundswell of resistance to corporate rule that we profile, but until the uprising occurred after the brutal murder of George Floyd at the hands of police, to tell you the honest truth, we were really pushing it. It was hard. I never really, perhaps believed, I wanted it to end. And as filmmakers, we're pressured to have hopeful films, unlike authors, right?
Yeah, right, exactly.
Why do we have to be hopeful and they don't? But for me,
so you weren't buying your own ending until the second time. Until the second time you opened up your picture lock.
Exactly, I wasn't buying our own ending, and then this uprising occurred with such passion and effectiveness and eloquence and like such standing so firmly in the side of justice and against white supremacy, and not only though challenging individual acts of racism, but challenging systemic racism, right? Challenging the system and linking the system to larger issues Like, why were the police and military getting all these funds and the hospitals were not, right? Or why is poverty racialized? Or, you know, so it was anyway, it was a very hopeful and inspiring movement, and still is. And it's not like it was allowed to happen by anyone. It happened despite the repression, despite grabbing protesters off the street in unmarked vehicles and sending in militarized police. So all of a sudden there was this example where there was resistance by many and solidarity among so many that actually felt like it had the solidity that it could battle and match the corporate behemoth, right? So I'll just say, for me, it was only after the uprising happened, and you know, if Angela Davis is saying she never expected anything like this in her lifetime, you know, and she's been working on these issues for 50 years, I mean, I can say that. I mean, it's like, wow. So for me, it really does have an authentically hopeful end because of the uprising. So Magnitude is very different in the sense that it's you know, it's a personal reckoning in many ways. But it's not supposed to be personal in terms of just focused on me. That's not at all what I want. It's more that I believe I can only speak for myself, right? Like, I can't speak for you and how you're feeling, right? I can only speak for myself, and that's the intent, where I come to a place where I've looked at these issues, and crucially, I have gone towards that which I fear. You know, I have gone towards the deepest, darkest places, as opposed to running from them. And I think ultimately, for me, you know, I hope that Magnitude sort of infuses for people who may be feeling a little shaky, and if they are, understandably, I am too, you know, courage, right? Like, courage to go towards our deepest fears and sorrows about the future, because it's a very scary future. And to find the strength to get up and continue to fight, and to know that you have the strength to face what is to come. And also to understand that hope is complex, because that's something that you can either, as Roger Hallam in Magnitude says, you know, there's two dynamics. There's the dynamic that we're depressed and something happens that gives us a little hope, and then we act. Or, which is maybe more the experience of most people right now, we lose hope. We lose hope, and then we go, okay, you know, I can't rely on anyone else. It's just like we lose hope, and we understand the urgency of this moment in time, and we understand, you know, what brings us meaning as human beings in our life. And we find the courage to get up in the morning and to fight with every cell in our body. And that's, I hope, the message of Magnitude.
What a beautiful note to end on. Congratulations on two incredible films, on making it through to the starting line of launching them, and thank you immensely for this conversation and for your beautiful work. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Abby. It's been so lovely to reconnect and to have this conversation with you. Thank you.
And thank you so much.
And apologies to everyone whose questions I didn't get in. I was a little self-indulgent in my chance to talk to Jen about the things that in the work.
Well, it was an amazing conversation. Thank you, Avi and Jennifer. I mean, what a treat to have you both talking about these two films. Really, really, really amazing. Congratulations, as Avi said, Jennifer, on the two films. Really looking forward to the response, to the follow-up, but I'm sure it'll be huge. I mean, these are important films that everybody should be watching. To those tuning in, tune in again Tuesday night, 7 p.m. Eastern, for an in-depth conversation with Quebec filmmaker Sonia Bonspiel-Boileau. She'll be in conversation with filmmaker Jeanne Leblanc, talking about her groundbreaking film, Rustic Oracle. And on Wednesday night, for director Tracy Deer, talking about her buzzworthy film, Beans, in conversation with former executive director of Imaginative, Jason Ryle. Find the links to those and all upcoming sessions at dgc.ca Visionaries 2020. We'll also be sending out specific invitations on each day. It's going to be fantastic. Jennifer, Avi, again, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you being with us here tonight and having this conversation. Really, really fantastic. Thank you again, and be well.
Thank you so much. Thank you.